The night Holt Beauchamp got thrown out of the kitchen, there were 63 people in that dining room. 63 people who would later tell the story differently, depending on who they were, where they sat, and how much they needed to believe they'd done nothing wrong. But the kitchen staff remembered exactly what happened. They always do. Holt Beauchamp was 51 years old the night his hands shook not from fear but from something closer to grief. He had been washing dishes at Dorval's for 11 months. 11 months of arriving before anyone else, leaving after the last pot was scrubbed, nodding quietly when the sous chef barked at him, saying nothing when the servers walked past him like he was part of the plumbing. The restaurant was on King Street West in Toronto, the kind of place that charged $42 for a duck breast and called it modest. The kind of place that had a sommelier who introduced himself as though the title were a credential from God. Holt had worked in places like this before. He knew their rhythms. He knew them the way a man knows the street he grew up on, not because he loved it, but because he had no choice but to learn its turns. The job at Dorval's had come through a cousin who knew someone who knew someone. It was January. Holt had just moved back to Toronto after 16 years in Lyon, and the Canadian winter had a way of making a man take whatever was available. The position was dishwasher. The pay was $17 an hour. He took it without hesitation and without explanation, signed a single sheet of paper in the manager's office, and showed up the next morning with his own rubber gloves because he'd learned decades ago that the ones they gave you were always 2 sizes too small. Nobody asked him much. That was fine. He had not come to Dorval's to talk. The head chef's name was Nolan Whitford, 38 years old, trained in Paris for 3 years on his parents' money, written up in Toronto Life twice. He had the particular confidence of a man who has been told he is talented since childhood and has never once been given a reason to question it. His kitchen ran hot, not just in temperature, but in tension, in ego, in the barely contained theater of performance that passes for professionalism in certain fine dining establishments. Whitford ran his kitchen the way some men drive, accelerating through things they don't notice until it's too late to stop. He had hired the dishwasher without interviewing him. That was the manager's job below his concern. He barely registered Holt's presence in the 11 months they shared the same building. Holt was background. Holt was infrastructure. Holt was the sound of water and clinking glass at the far end of the room, until the night of the winter gala. The gala was a private event. The restaurant had been booked out entirely. 63 guests, all of them associated in various ways with a real estate development firm called Sutherland Graves Group. Their CEO, a man named Raymond Sutherland, was celebrating the closing of a deal that had taken 4 years, 2 environmental reviews, and what people in certain circles called creative negotiation. The deal was worth $340 million. Raymond Sutherland was the kind of man who felt that number deserved an occasion worthy of itself. He had rented Dorval's for the evening. He had approved the menu, the floral arrangements, the playlist, and the seating chart. He had also, at his wife's suggestion, arranged for a live musical performance to accompany the appetizer course. His wife, Diane Sutherland, had a thing for classical music. Raymond Sutherland had a thing for giving his wife what she wanted because it cost less than the alternative. The performer who had been booked was a pianist named Sébastien Morel. Young, French-Canadian, recently featured at a small festival in Montreal. He had confirmed the engagement 3 weeks prior, charged a reasonable fee, and then, 40 minutes before the guests arrived, sent a message saying he had food poisoning and would not be coming. The event coordinator, a woman named Giselle Tremblay, spent 27 minutes on the phone trying to find a replacement. She found nobody. She went to the restaurant manager. The restaurant manager went to Whitford. Whitford shrugged and said the event could proceed without music. It wasn't his problem. Giselle Tremblay went back to her phone. Nobody thought to ask Holt Beauchamp. That was not unusual. Nobody ever asked Holt Beauchamp anything beyond whether the stockpots had been rinsed. What happened next began small. During the appetizer course, while the servers moved through the dining room with plates of beef tartare and pickled beet salad, Holt stepped out through the kitchen's side door to take the recycling to the bin in the alley. On his way back in, he passed by the small anteroom near the private dining space where the restaurant kept its upright Yamaha, the one used for the occasional jazz brunch on Sundays. The piano had not been moved. Giselle Tremblay had arranged for a baby grand to be rented for the event, a polished Steinway that sat at the front of the private room on a low riser, lid open, waiting for a performer who was not coming. Holt stopped in the anteroom. He stood very still. He could hear from the dining room the particular sound of 63 people performing the ritual of wealth. That specific murmur of voices that speaks of comfort so complete it has become unremarkable. He had heard that sound in restaurants in Lyon, in Paris, in Singapore, in New York. He had heard it from both sides of the kitchen door. He had not sat at a piano in 4 months. He went back to the dishes. He lasted another 30 minutes. It was the Steinway that did it. Not vanity, not nostalgia, just the piano itself, sitting there with its lid open and no one coming. There was something that felt like waste in it, and Holt Beauchamp had spent his life in kitchens where waste was considered a kind of violence. He told himself he would only go to look. He walked into the private dining room through the service entrance. The guests were mid-conversation. The servers were moving. Nobody looked up. He walked to the piano the way he walked to every station in the kitchen, directly without announcement, because the work doesn't wait for you to introduce yourself. He sat down. He set his hands on the keys. The first sound he made was barely anything. A single chord, low and quiet, almost testing whether the instrument was real. Then another. And then, because his hands remembered long before his mind decided, the opening of a Schubert impromptu, not performed, not displayed. Just played the way a man breathes when he's finally able to. The room changed, not dramatically, not all at once. But a table near the front went quiet, and then the one beside it, and the sound that came from the piano was not the sound of a dishwasher who had sat down uninvited. It was the sound of someone who had lived inside music for so long that music had rearranged itself around him. Giselle Tremblay stood near the service door with her clipboard and did not move. One of the servers stopped mid-step and stayed stopped. A woman at table 4 touched her husband's arm without looking at him. Raymond Sutherland noticed none of this. Raymond Sutherland was at the head table, explaining to a city councilor why the environmental review had taken longer than expected, when his chief of staff leaned over and said something in his ear. Raymond Sutherland looked up. He looked across the room at the man sitting at the Steinway. He took in the gray work shirt, the black rubber-soled shoes, the dish gloves still pushed up on one wrist because Holt had not thought to remove them before he sat down. Raymond Sutherland's face went through several things in quick succession. He stood up. He did not walk calmly. That was the thing people remembered afterward, that he moved through the dining room like a man who felt his property was being handled without permission, which was exactly what he felt. His guests watched him go. Some of them had been listening to the music. Some of them had tears on the edges of their eyes that they were quietly pretending weren't there. Raymond Sutherland reached the piano. He did not say anything first. He put his hand on Holt Beauchamp's shoulder, not gently, and pulled him back from the keys. Holt stopped playing. The room went completely silent. Not the polite silence of an intermission. The silence of 63 people who have just watched something happen and are waiting to understand what it means. Raymond Sutherland looked at Holt. He looked at the dish gloves on Holt's wrist. He looked at the gray shirt with the small Dorval's logo on the chest. He said loudly enough that it carried, "What do you think you're doing at my piano?" Holt said nothing. "This is a private event. You're a kitchen worker. Get back where you belong." There is a specific way that certain men say that phrase, "where you belong." That has nothing to do with geography. Raymond Sutherland said it that way. Everyone in the room understood what he meant. Some of them looked at the tablecloth. Some of them looked at Raymond Sutherland. A very few looked at Holt Beauchamp with an expression that was trying to be sympathy and landing somewhere closer to discomfort. Nolan Whitford had appeared at the service entrance. He looked at his dishwasher at the Steinway. He looked at Raymond Sutherland's hand on Holt's shoulder. He said nothing. He was calculating the way people calculate when they have something to protect. Raymond Sutherland pointed toward the kitchen. "Now." Holt Beauchamp stood up from the piano bench slowly, the way men stand up when they have decided that their dignity is not negotiable. He turned and walked toward the service entrance. He did not hurry. He did not look at the floor. Giselle Tremblay, still standing by the wall, watched him go. She was the one who had pulled up his work history when he'd first come in for the position. She was the one who had seen, briefly, the line on his resume that said he had worked at a restaurant in Lyon called Maison Calière. She had not followed up on it because dishwashers did not need their references checked the way chefs did. She was thinking about that now. Back in the kitchen, Holt Beauchamp stood at his station. The dishwasher ran. The water was hot. He pulled his gloves down properly and went back to work, because that is what you do when you have been doing this long enough to know that the work is not the humiliation. The humiliation is something else, something you carry separately, and you get to put it down eventually. But Giselle Tremblay was already on her phone in the corridor. She had looked up Maison Callière, Lyon. She had found what she was looking for in under 4 minutes. She found the Le Progrès article from 2009. She found the review in Le Monde from 2011. She found the profile in Saveurs magazine from 2014, a full-page piece, with a photograph titled, "The Chef Who Plays Chopin Between Services." She found the record of the Bocuse d'Or 2013, where the Canadian team had placed second, and she found the name of the chef who had led that team, Holt Beauchamp. She stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she went back into the dining room. Raymond Sutherland had returned to his table. The conversation had resumed, but it had the quality of a conversation that is working hard to resume. Forced, slightly too loud, aware of itself. The Steinway sat empty. Nobody suggested moving on. The silence it left was larger than the room knew what to do with. Giselle Tremblay walked to the head table. She did not wait for a pause in the conversation. She set her phone down in front of Raymond Sutherland with the Saveurs article open. "Photograph up," she said quietly but without softening it. "The man you just removed from the piano is Holt Beauchamp. He led Canada's Bocuse d'Or team in 2013. He ran a Michelin-starred kitchen in Lyon for 8 years. He has cooked for 3 heads of state, including at a state dinner in Ottawa in 2017. Raymond Sutherland looked at the phone. He looked at the photograph, a younger Holt in chef's whites, standing in a kitchen full of copper pans, holding a ladle and looking at the camera the way people look at cameras when they have nothing to prove. Raymond Sutherland said nothing. He also, Giselle Tremblay continued, trained classically in piano before he trained in cooking. He studied at the Royal Conservatory of Music in Toronto for 6 years before he ever set foot in a professional kitchen. The table was very still. The city councillor across from Raymond Sutherland had picked up his own phone and was looking something up. His expression shifted. His wife had put her hand over her mouth. Giselle Tremblay took her phone back. She said, "I thought you should know." She walked back to the service entrance. In the kitchen, someone had told Holt what was happening. One of the servers, a young Somali-Canadian woman named no one in the dining room had ever learned, had come through the service door and said, quietly, "She's telling him, right now. She's showing him." Holt kept washing. "You should go back out there," the server said. Holt looked at her. "For what?" "Because he deserves to see your face when he finds out." Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he dried his hands on the cloth by the sink. He took off his gloves. He set them neatly on the edge of the rack. He walked to the service entrance and pushed open the door. The dining room was very quiet. 63 people looked at him. Some of them knew now. Some of them were still learning. All of them watched him walk across the room to the Steinway, and none of them said anything, and he did not look at Raymond Sutherland, and he did not look at the floor. He sat down. He placed his hands on the keys. He did not begin with Schubert this time. He began with something slower, a nocturne, Chopin, the one in E-flat, the one that sounds less like music and more like something that has been kept inside a long time and is only now being let out. He played it the way he had played it at 17 years old in a practice room on Bloor Street, when he was trying to decide between the piano and the kitchen, when he didn't yet know that a person could lose both and come back to both and still be whole. The room was very still. A woman at table 7 was crying and not hiding it. The city councillor had set his phone face down and was just listening. And then, the way Holt Beauchamp always did when he was playing for himself and not for an audience, he shifted. The Chopin dissolved. Not abruptly, but the way weather dissolves, gradually, inevitable, and what came in its place was something different. Something with a different rhythm in it. Something with the particular weight of Canadian winter in it, of January on King Street West, of a man who had been in Lyon for 16 years and knew the exact moment he needed to come home. The kitchen staff had gathered at the service entrance. Whitford was among them. He was standing in the back, not saying anything, not moving. his arms crossed over his chest, in a posture that had started as defensiveness and had somewhere along the way become something that looked more like awe. Holt played for 22 minutes. He played without stopping, without flourish, without any gesture toward the room, because the room was not why he was playing. He was playing because the piano had been empty, and he had been empty too for 4 months, and some things you put down, and some things put themselves back in your hands when you stop fighting it. When he finished, he sat still for a moment, his hands on his knees, the last note in the air. Then 63 people in that room began to make noise. Raymond Sutherland left before dessert. His wife did not leave with him. Diane Sutherland stayed until the end of the evening, and when the last guests were filing out, she found Giselle Tremblay near the coat check and said, "I want to know if he takes private commissions for events." Giselle Tremblay said she would find out. She already knew the answer. The story moved the way stories move now, fast, through phones, through screenshots, through the particular velocity of something that touches a nerve the internet has been pressing for a long time. A guest had filmed part of the performance on their phone, not the confrontation, but the playing, 2.5 minutes of Holt Beauchamp at a Steinway in a gray work shirt, the Dorval's logo visible on his chest. It had 400,000 views by morning. By the following afternoon, the Toronto Star had run a piece. The headline was, "The Dishwasher at the Piano." Toronto's Holt Beauchamp played for 3 heads of state. Last night he played for his boss. The piece was 2,000 words. It had a photograph from 2013 and a photograph from the night before, side by side. Nolan Whitford gave no comment. Raymond Sutherland's communications team issued a statement about how proud Sutherland Graves Group was to have helped bring this extraordinary talent back to the stage. The statement was deleted 3 hours later, after several Toronto journalists pointed out that Raymond Sutherland had ejected the man from the piano. A second statement was not issued. What happened after was not a dramatic reversal, because life does not work in dramatic reversals for men like Holt Beauchamp. What happened was quieter and more real, and in some ways more satisfying for being so. The Royal Conservatory of Music reached out, not to offer him a position, they had no position to offer, but to ask if he would give a masterclass. He said yes. He did the masterclass on a Saturday morning in February. 32 students showed up. By the end of the first hour, 6 of them were openly emotional, and the other 26 were pretending not to be. And Holt Beauchamp was talking about the relationship between technique and hunger. Not hunger as ambition, but hunger as the literal bodily need that makes a person touch a thing with full attention. A restaurant group called him. Not Dorval's, a different one, a smaller one, a place called Hargrove's on Dundas West, run by a woman who had grown up in Trinidad and built her restaurant over 20 years without ever compromising what she actually wanted to cook. She did not offer him a position as dishwasher. She offered him a consulting arrangement, and she said, a kitchen whenever he wanted one. No title, no pressure. Just the work, if he wanted it. He wanted it. He kept the consulting arrangement for 3 years before they made him a partner. And by then, the James Beard Committee had already reached out about the profile. And the Globe and Mail food section had already run the piece. And the piece had run under a headline that Holt had quietly requested they change before publication. They had wanted to call it a comeback, and he had told the writer that a comeback requires a departure, and he had not departed. He had been here the whole time. They changed the headline. Giselle Tremblay left event coordination 6 months later. She had a cousin who ran a small agency representing musicians and emerging artists, and the agency needed someone who understood both the logistics of live performance and the particular stubborn dignity of people who make things. She turned out to be very good at the job. She and Holt Beauchamp had coffee in March. It was a Thursday cold, the kind of Toronto cold that has decided to stay through spring out of principle. They sat at a window table at a place on College Street, and she told him she'd almost not pulled up his resume that night. She'd almost just let it go. Holt looked at her. He said, "You didn't know." "No," she said. "That's the point," he said. "You should have." He was not angry when he said it. He was something more difficult than angry. He was tired and clear and precise. He meant not specifically her, not specifically that night. He meant the whole system of assumptions that had placed him at the sink and Raymond Sutherland at the head table and had required a phone screen with a photograph to complicate the arrangement that everyone had accepted without examining. Giselle Tremblay nodded. She didn't argue. She had spent 6 months thinking about exactly this. "The thing that stays with me," she said, "is how quiet you were, all those months. How quiet you were." Holt wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Outside, a streetcar went by, its noise familiar and indifferent and exactly right. "Quiet isn't the same as absent," he said. Raymond Sutherland was at a conference in Calgary when the Toronto Star piece ran. He read it on his phone in the elevator of his hotel. He read it twice. He did not call anyone. He did not comment publicly, and he did not comment privately, and he did not, as far as anyone could tell, reflect on it in any way that resulted in a changed pattern of behavior. He continued to run Sutherland Graves Group. He continued to close deals. He continued to look through people when he needed to, and at them when they were useful, which is the oldest and most ordinary form of cruelty there is, the kind that requires no drama and leaves no marks. But 63 people had been in that room, and 63 people had sat in silence while a man in a gray work shirt with dish gloves pushed up his wrist played Chopin on a rented Steinway and made the kind of sound that gets into the body and doesn't leave. Some things you can't walk back from, not because the consequences are so severe, but because the truth, once heard, becomes the standard against which everything else sounds thin. Raymond Sutherland would spend the rest of his professional life explaining, not always out loud, not always consciously, why he was still worth listening to. The piano was easier than he was. The piano had just required someone to sit down and play, and Holt Beauchamp had done that. He had done it in a gray work shirt with his name stitched above the pocket in white thread, in a room full of people who had not expected him, on an evening that no one had planned for him, with hands that had never forgotten what they were for.